What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony, let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're all having a lovely start to the weekend. I'm on a business trip currently, and so unfortunately this episode is going to be a little bit shorter, but I still wanted to get an episode out because of so much that's been happening this week. Just a warning up front, this is going to be a very finance, macroeconomic, property sector, basically economic heavy episode. So if that's not really your thing, even though this is very, very important to cover, just a warning that this may not be your video. And as always guys, it's always a huge help if you enjoy the content to hit the like button. It really does help. Okay, first up, let's discuss the role credit is going to play in China's economy this year. With so many economic headwinds so early in the year, from a housing sector crash, more on this soon, to war in Europe, to crippling lockdowns in Shanghai and other cities, which we've been following closely this week, we were not surprised when the State Council on Wednesday announced that economic challenges have, quote-unquote, exceeded expectations, and that more aggressive monetary and fiscal responses will be needed. Indeed, we predicted that this would happen beforehand. Beijing will seek to kickstart China's sluggish economy this year with a jolt of credit. As Tyson points out here, the expansion of total social financing, TSF, a broad measure of credit and liquidity in the economy, decelerated for most of last year. In the fourth quarter, a gauge of overall loan demand fell for the third straight quarter on both year-on-year and quarter-on-quarter bases. The analysts with the publication expressed, quote, "Economists expect that the central bank will further cut interest rates in banks' reserve requirement ratio, RRR, this year, although some are concerned that the Russia-Ukraine war could lead to greater inflationary pressure, creating constraints for monetary policy." End quote. More on this in a moment. However, there is another concern. If demand for credit is too weak, then easing measures will have little effect. We know that historically cheap credit has been sucked up by property developers in the past, and households too, to be pumped into the housing market. But with the housing crisis smashing both investor and consumer confidence, there is little appetite for this credit. In February, according to data from the consultancy China Real Estate Information Corp., the amount raised by the top 100 Chinese real estate firms plunged almost 60% year-on-year and almost 60% month-on-month. This was driven by the biggest reduction in mortgage loans in more than a decade, with consumption still yet to return to pre-pandemic levels and likely being hit hard with lockdowns this year. Businesses in the aggregate will also be hesitant to expand. In December, the People's Bank of China cut the RRR rate, injecting about 1.2 trillion RMB, $188 billion into the financial system. The following month, the central bank again acted, lowering the interest rate on its one-year medium-term lending facility, MLF, and committed to, quote, "opening the monetary policy toolbox wider, maintain stability in the money supply, and avoid a collapse in credit," end quote. We followed these developments at the time. Yet despite all of this, credit demand has remained weak. January started off okay, but then by February credit growth weakened, with new yuan-denominated loans coming in at 1.23 trillion RMB, down both month-on-month and year-on-year. At the time, both Bloomberg and Yicai reported that the February figures were well below market expectations. There was also a debate regarding how constrained China's monetary policy has become due to the war in Ukraine. Popular and outspoken economist Ran Zeping has warned that the war has pushed up global commodity prices and raised the risk of imported inflation in China. Mr. Ran Zeping is a former economist with a major Chinese company who had warned his employer that if changes were not made urgently, then the company would face serious financial risk. The company ignored the warnings and he left. The name of the company? China Evergrande. However, other economists have argued that China's monetary policy is relatively insulated from the effects of the war in Europe. Xu Gao, for example, chief economist at BOCI Securities Limited, said that domestic inflationary pressure isn't heavy, and we remember that economists at Nomura Holdings Inc. said in a note last month that it is highly likely the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, will make further interest rate cuts this month. The question of monetary constraints is largely moot, however, if, as we touched on before, there is no demand, or better put, there is not enough demand for credit. If this is the case, if Beijing wishes to achieve politically acceptable growth levels in GDP, and especially if it wants to reach its ambitious growth target of 5.5%, then it needs to turn to its old playbook, and that means infrastructure. We will be exploring this topic, including increasing criticism of this policy response from domestic analysts and economists, and what this will all mean for Chinese growth in 2022 in the next video. Hey everybody, as always, thank you so much for your ongoing support of the channel. I really appreciate it. For those of you watching this episode for the first time, if you're enjoying the content, if you're getting some value from the content, maybe consider subscribing, hit the bell notification. You'll have the most up-to-date analysis on China when I release these every day. And for anyone who wants to go the extra mile, as always, my Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee details are in the description below. This is a wonderful way to help the channel stay sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, let's move on now to the Evergrande Housing Crisis, and we have new sales data. When financial regulators were finally able to convince senior policy makers to implement much-needed measures to force the over-bloated bubble housing sector to deleverage, everyone knew that it was going to be painful. But just how painful it would be and whether the government would stick to the measures was always up in the air. However, we can now see that the Chinese economy has been taking a hit in recent months. Beijing has now shifted its focus away from deleveraging to stabilizing growth. With the property industry representing over 20% and as high as 30% of China's GDP, that means stabilizing the housing sector is part of this stabilization effort. As such, we have seen authorities roll out a series of measures to boost the real estate industry over the last 2 months. We've been following all of these measures both at the central level and at the local level, particularly at the local level over the last few weeks. However, devastating Q1 data shows that these measures have not been enough. New data published yesterday by the China Real Estate Information Corp shows that sales of China's top 50 property developers collapsed an astonishing 47% in the first quarter year-on-year. What's more, sales in this first quarter are even lower than the historically low levels we saw in Q1 of 2020 when the pandemic first blew up and China saw its first quarterly contraction in the economy in almost 30 years. Caixin reports that though multiple developers had already heavily revised down their sales goals for the first quarter due to the Evergrande crisis, many of them barely reached 60% of these conservative targets. So looking at all of this, we cannot help but come to the conclusion that Beijing really does still have a very serious housing crisis on its hands. Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.